Folks, welcome back to another episode of the IMGPH podcast. Have you ever wondered about geography? Some of you might think about maps from school, some of you might think about rocks, or some of you might think about the entire world in general. Well, what's interesting is geography has a bigger influence on the world of public health than we know. And to introduce that concept, we have an amazing guest, Dr. Prince Michael Amerbor. Dr. Amerbor is an assistant professor of global public health at NYU GPH. He's a health geographer working within the overarching theme of environmental and social determinants of health and healthcare seeking behavior. His research uses big data and multi-method approach to unravel environmental and social-spatial health inequalities in sub-Saharan Africa and other geographical contexts. But why should we hear it over here? Let's hear it from our guest itself. Dr. Amerbor, welcome to the IMGPH podcast. Glad to have you here.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine.
So can you explain to me, when I saw geography while looking you up, I'm thinking geography. Geography was like a class where I had to, color the maps in class.
Yeah.
How did geography get you into public health?
Well, actually, I had that interest when I was applying for undergraduate studies back in Ghana. And one of the courses or the programs available was geography and resource development, sociology, and archaeology. But over the years, I had thought of majoring in sociology. But as I delved more into geography and got exposed to the concept, understood the key issues like spatial inequalities, in some of the major issues of concern to society, it kind of piqued my interest in the program. So I majored in geography and health because I've always been fascinated about health and health outcome. So one will say probably I'm a disappointed medical student, someone who wanted to go to medical school but didn't end up in a medical school. Yeah, but it's always fascinating because mostly where we live influence our health. And as a child growing up, I realized that, the community I lived in influenced people's health outcome in terms of the things we are exposed to either physically or socially or, or emotionally. Yeah, so that's what drove me towards that end.
So you mentioned this thing about there were some really complicated words you used when it came to geography, right? Yeah. Can you simplify that so I understand how what's interesting is that there's where your location is, what the upbringing, it has a lot to do with your location in the world, has a lot to do with public health. What about geography in the beginning were some words you used that, this is very interesting. They felt like long. What do those words mean in terms of how can we simplify geography when it comes to someone who might not even know what a major in geography is?
Yeah, so you can think of geography basically as the study of the earth, right? And when you look at the earth, there are so many things that makes up the earth, right? We have human society, which you can term as the anthropogenic, part. You have the natural environment, the trees, the rivers, the things, the natural stuff that's fun, topography, drawing of the hills and the valleys and stuff. Yeah. Then you have the in between the built environments, the cities, the railway, the transport, and everything. So as geography, we look at the totality of all these factors and how it informs human environment interaction. So, and there are different disciplines or sub-disciplines in geography. So you have economic geographers who look at it from the economic side. So how does all these things together impact economic life and well-being? Then you have the health geographers, my field, where we look at all these factors and how it impacts human health and well-being. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay. Geography is a lot more than I thought it was, right?
Yeah. Some people term this as the jack of all trade and master of none, because it's you can apply it in every field and every concept, right? Because everything we do takes place in space, right? And these space are embodied by human beings. They are embodied by culture. So all these things are of interest to geographers. Yeah.
I'm so curious, I probably haven't thought of geography in a decade. And till I started reading about it and before you were coming on the podcast. And I'm very curious who might be some famous names that we know in the world that can help simplify that this person is a geographer. How do we think of that?
Who do I know? Almost most of the geographers I know are in the academia. So for example, there is this famous American geographer who was once the president of the American Geographers Association, Carl Alton Saar, and he defined geography as the morphology of landscape. So basically, whatever make up the landscape we live in, and there are other well-known geographers like Humboldt and Ritter. I don't know, but in terms of in terms of either celebrities and others, honestly have no idea. But most of the people I know probably speak volume of my interest and where I lean towards, basically in the academia. So yeah, but back in Ghana there are a lot of politicians and who are geographers. So there were a former minister of I think either trade or something who was a geographer. Yeah.
Wow. So what's so cool to hear is that it impacts everyone. Like geography is we are geography. Yeah. Our life is geography. This table, wherever we are, this building is geography. Urban, it goes into that. So that's so interesting that it, like you said, jack of all trades and master of none at the same time.
Yeah.
Let's go into the public health realm, and maybe we can talk about geography a little bit more. What is a health geographer?
Yeah, so basically a health geographer is someone who applies geographic thinking, methods and technique to understand health issues, right? So you could, for example, some of the key questions you may want to ask yourself is, why is that people in Denmark have a higher life expectancy than, let's say, someone in the United States or someone in Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Or why is it that, for example, let's say, certain groups, population groups, irrespective of whether they are in Europe or United States, have similar, demographic or certain health characteristics. So these are some of the key issues that geographers we probe into. In terms of, there's always the component of space, in our thinking. So whatever you look at in terms of health, for example, maybe a doctor will look at infection among patients. Then we are looking at where is the patient located? How does the environment that the patient lived in contributed to the health exposure that the person is reporting to? Are there other factors within either the environment itself or the social environment itself that contribute to it? Comparing these patients to someone who live elsewhere, would that person also have the same risks of, contracting that disease? So these are some of the critical spatial thinking that we ask as geographers in the realm of public health.
So it seems like geography is a large scale thing that targets everything in the world. So there's fundamentals of geography, and then a lot of, you mentioned the famous person you were mentioning before that, right? So you're looking at it from a health angle. So you can look at geography from multiple angles, and is that how the industry is kind of revolving in geography?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say large scale, but there is scale in geography. Every geography study, right? So for example, if you pick New York as a city, it's clustered and patterned, right? You find, I'm sure you find certain socioeconomic groups living somewhere or some part of the city compared to others, right? So that's of interest. And you can go bigger than New York to maybe the States, right? Or even the country of United States. So probably you find that maybe in the West Coast, because of these high educational institutions, you have like NYU and others, maybe the population around West Coast are more highly educated than, say, population in other parts of the country. Right. So it depends on the skill. But whatever skill you apply, there is often key and critical questions that are of interest to us as geographers. Even within a community, a neighborhood, there are still differences. And we as geographers are interested in understanding be the differences or the similarities among population. So if there are similarities, why? Right? Because as individuals, we have our own interest and others. So if there are similarities, it's also of interest to geographers. Why the similarities? What makes them behave the way they do? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really this is very interesting. There's a lot of the students that come to our school, from what I hear after talking to them, is that there's a lot of data involved.
Yeah.
There's this entire class on, I think, some stats and math, and it seems like a very hard, difficult class for them to do, right? We had a podcast with this thing called with an organization at the school called PQAR, qualitative research, and getting quantitative research together for everyone else. And in your intro, we spoke about data. Why is data so important in geography?
There's this saying that knowledge is power, and you got that knowledge from data, right? Yeah. So without the data, you don't have that knowledge of what is happening among your population or whatever group or society you are interested in as a researcher or even as a policymaker. So that's where it comes from. And even though often we emphasize quantitative data or looking at the numbers, if I should say, but geographers are also interested in the words, people's experiences, because sometimes you understand the numbers. For example, number is telling you that A causes B, right? But as in how A causes B, you don't know, right? So for example, someone may have contracted COVID as a result of maybe going for a party. Someone may have contracted this probably because they went to a hospital for care, right? So the modes of exposure, how they got it is different. Right. So that's why the qualitative aspect or the words aspect also becomes crucial to geographers. So it's not always about the numbers, because the numbers, it's important because everything, like I said, is structured and patterned. But you also want to capture the experience, the motivations. You know, for example, someone is sick and they go to the hospital, the doctor recommends this, or even let's pick this critical issue that is on these vaccine deniers, right? Why is that some people embrace vaccination whilst others don't? You know, you want to hear the experiences. You can go with the numbers, all right, but you don't get the richness of, what is the motivations behind either denying a vaccination or, embracing vaccination uptake, So, yeah.
Let's target this one final academic concept before we go open up this door a lot more, right? There was this thing I was reading that you wrote recently within the Public Health newsletter on geospatial thinking. What is now, we've spoken about geography, we've spoken about data and its importance and how geography targets public health. What is geospatial thinking? How can people in public health or even outside of public health learn from geospatial thinking?
So basically, geospatial thinking is basically applying the geographic concept to the space, and space is everything around us, right? So and geospatial thinking is crucial, especially in this time of the of our life or of human history, because of the inequalities that exist within our society, right? And if you look at especially the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, inequality often comes along as one of the key things that they seek to address, either in terms of poverty, reducing poverty, or improving health among certain vulnerable population, right? And to be able to target or design interventions for these populations, you need to know where are my population, where are the vulnerable population. And to do that, you need this geospatial thinking and geospatial techniques to identify them, right? And how we often construe vulnerability differs, right? So probably let's pick these tornadoes that were happening recently. Certain communities or areas in the United States are more prone to the effect of tornadoes than others. Others may be prone to the effect of, let's say, hurricanes. Others might be prone to the effect of heat waves, right? So the vulnerability differs. And so geospatial thinking kind of organizes, these things in a way that is very easy for us as human beings to understand. And, as humans, we are very visual, right? For example, if you watch a video, let's say you are in high school, you are given the option to read, let's say, Macbeth, written in the old, Elizabethan English, or to watch the video or the movie. Most people will opt for the movie because you can remember, more than, reading. So as humans, we are more inclined to visual depictions, and that's what geospatial thinking comes in. So we often visualize this data, try to map it, and identify key vulnerable areas or whatever is of interest, right? Then see how best we can use policies to intervene in the kind of things that we are seeing based on what the data is telling us, right? So, for example, if I'm designing a program that seeks to encourage vaccine uptake. I know that, okay, there's low uptake in this community, and based on the richness from maybe the interviews you did, you know that these are the reasons. So maybe I need to target more educational material towards this part rather than probably pushing it to a place like New York where maybe about 95% or 99% of the population are already taking up vaccines.
There's so much there, right? What do you think of right now? You're a health geographer. What do you think of when I say the word environment? What comes to your mind?
A lot of things. First, this is an environment. Where we are now is an environment itself. So environment is very broad, and often it can be ambiguous depending on how it's used. You can refer to environment as being the nature, like the natural things, the trees, the animals, things you see in the wild, jungle, safari, Tarzan, Or you can go further into social relations among people. That's also an environment. That's the social environment. You can look at it from, the human's modification to the the natural environment, the city, the skyscrapers, the parks, the railways, cars, and others. So it's a very broad concept, and often when you use it in research or even in policy, you need to clearly define what you are referring to when you use the term environment. Yeah.
Okay, makes sense. There's another part of it, right? You mentioned a lot about like locations and different environments for people. We hear a lot about climate change recently, and everyone knows about climate change. They have a different relationship with it. How would you simplify what climate change is for everyone? Like this is climate change. How would you talk about that?
So first, before we delve into that, you need to distinguish between climate change and weather, right? Or climate and weather. So when we talk about weather, we are referring to the, whatever the condition is within a given location. And it's often on a smaller scale, maybe a city or even a neighborhood, and it could be the temperature, the rainfall pattern, and others. But when we are talking about climate, we are looking at the long-term pattern of these weather conditions, right? So we know that probably in between April to let's say June, in New York, ideally there should maybe less rainfall. There should be temperature should hover around. Sorry, I'm used to the the metric system. So maybe around 25 degrees centigrade and others. But in the situation where so climate is actually I think the rule of thumb is 30 years, right? Average weather conditions for any given location, and it often transcends just locality. It can be for a whole country or even a series of countries or a region, right? So they all have similar characteristics in terms of how the weather conditions is supposed to be within a given time frame based on what we've studied. Now, climate change is where these the range that we understand start to deviate, right? So instead of, for example, temperature, right, let's say in the current period, the temperature hovering around 23, we are having temperatures going maybe 40, 45, and it's occurring frequently. Sometimes you have some anomalies. It's once in a while, yes, understandable. But once it keeps happening, you have frequent heat waves as a result of high temperatures. You have frequent flooding. You have frequent hurricanes. Whilst ideally you are supposed to have, let's say, 1 or 2 within a given year, but you are having repeatedly. Then it tells you that there's something happening, and that's what climate change is about.
Wow. Okay, that was very, very easy to understand. Very well explained. So, is in the world of climate change, right? We look at 30 years of data, like you mentioned, and how is it natural for our world to do this? It seems like it's unnatural, right? There's oftentimes like, is this a part of how the whatever planet revolves, and this climate is going to come, and this is the next 30 years, and then it will change again? It seems like an anomaly because of environmental aspects that are man-made and pollution or things like that. Is that how it's being formed?
No. So when I talk about 30 years, I was referring to how we define the climate of a place. Correct. Right? So you need a minimum of 30-year data to be able to understand. For example, if I want to, let's say, find out how many, or let's say the net salary, right? for, let's say, NYU professors over the course of the year. I can pick probably this year, and it gives me information. But there are years that probably because of either recession or others, the salary will drop. So when you have it's the same as financial market. When you have a given range, it gives you a fair idea of what ideal situation is, right? So that's what I meant by the 30 year. But climate change has been a reoccurring phenomena in the Earth history. So give or take, the Earth is about 1.5 billion years, and there's been incidents of dramatic climatic changes in the Earth. So you have a period where it's called the whole Earth was basically covered with ice and snow. So the snowball Earth, as it was known. Then things happen. Often these are natural phenomena, like either volcanic eruptions, right, sending certain gases in that atmosphere. And because of these gases, by virtue of being there, they either warm the Earth or they block heat from coming from the sun, so cools the Earth. But the problem we are having now is the pace of change, right? So the natural ones take a long time to occur. Some could be thousands of years, even hundreds and thousands of years, right? But now most of the changes we are seeing are as a result of human activities. So our economic endeavors, either factory production, consumption, production of food, and all these things, we release certain gases and certain hazard into the atmosphere, and basically they are known as the greenhouse gases. So you can think of it as the in your backyard garden, you have this glass burden in order to regulate the temperature for certain kinds of plants. The same thing. When these gases are released into the atmosphere, they absorb the heat that the Earth emits to space. So instead of going back to space, they trap it and kind of warms the Earth, right? So excessive heat, and that's what is causing all these global warming, climate change issues. So the focus, yes, it's occurred in the Earth history, but the problem now is the pace at which it's occurring, right? So even if let's say at a certain point in time, the glaciers and the ice in the Arctic and the poles will melt, probably to take millions or even billions of years. But now it's taking place at a rapid pace, and that's what's of concern to researchers like me and other stakeholders. Yeah,
which means we will be unable to adapt based on where we stand right now in the world. And in order to do that, we have to make changes, significant changes, in order to combat this thing. Otherwise, worse times will hit us in a way that's unexpected.
And even if we talk about adaptation, certain countries might have the resources. Certain individuals, even within the United States, might have the resources. For example, if someone who lives closer to, let's say, the coasts, and they know that it's more likely to flood, maybe they'll have the money to raise up the foundation of their building, such that even if it's increased by that much, they can. But how many people can afford that, right? So while some people can adapt, put in measures to minimize the impact of climate change, majority of the population can't, right? And in the long run, it's not good for us, irrespective of whether you can adapt or you can put in certain mechanisms, right? There is this popular saying that when the last tree dies, the last man dies, right? Or the last human die. And it's often because we are dependent. We have this symbiotic relationship with nature, and whatever transformation we make to it impact on us. Often nature has to be in equilibrium, must be stable, right? We must be at peace. So if you look at most of our traditional societies, they often advocate for that concept of humans being at peace and at oneness with nature and the environment. And our recent lifestyle, it doesn't foster that kind of behavior. Hence, we are causing a lot of disturbance to nature. And yes, we need to start thinking critically about our actions and how it affects the environment we live in, and ultimately affects our health and well-being as well.
Certain regions in the world are impacted more than other regions.
Yeah.
Correct? And yes, you mentioned we're aware some areas are more prone to hurricanes. Some areas are more prone to, tsunamis or,
Yeah.
sea levels, right? What are some things beyond these climate factors, right? Like, could there be health inequities in the place, income of a certain region, the area it's located in?
Yeah, and yes, so ideally, even though we have these climatic or environmental effects happening as a result of climate change, but we realize that, like I said, as humans, our life is intertwined with the environment. Right. So whatever happens to the environment affects us. So, for example, in Sub-Saharan Africa and most of the global south or the so-called developing world, a lot of people depend on the environment for the sustenance, right? So if you look at the farmers, they depend on rainfall, they depend on maybe certain optimal temperature in order to harvest crops. Now, if rainfall becomes erratic, right, it leads to flooding, destruction of cropland, right, which affects household food security. That in turn affects, the level of nutrient they are getting, and it can lead to certain diseases like anemia and other, nutrition related. Now, the same thing, even the destruction of life and property as a result of these floods and hurricanes and tornadoes, right? And vulnerability comes, like you said, one, depending on the geography where the population is located, and also two, as a result of the socioeconomic conditions of that society, right? So certain societies might have the resources to maybe create certain technologies or buffers in order to minimize the impact. Bear in mind, we can minimize it. We can't totally eradicate it. So we minimize it, but most populations don't have that resources or technology to do that, right? So as we are even thinking about climate change effect, we also need to talk about the sharing of knowledge. Okay, we need to talk about equity in terms of how we share resources, how we share knowledge, we share some of these vital technologies that people need to, incorporate into their daily life in order to live healthy and sustainable lives, right? For example, we talk about, often when we are talking about climate change, we talk about the need to modify certain behavior, right? Maybe we need to minimize, let's say, logging in the tropics, and the Amazon, and in the Sub-Saharan Africa, Congo and other places. But if you go to the ground, you realize that for a lot of people, source of livelihood becomes a very key challenge for them, right? So right now, let's pick this example. In Ghana, there is this illegal mining activity going on, which has caused destruction to river bodies and forest, right? And we know how the importance of these environmental assets to climate and our well-being. Now, if you go and preach climate change, if you go and preach sustainability, the people in the community will not listen to you, because at the end of the day, they are thinking of how to make a living. How are we going to survive? Where are we getting our next meal from? And these are people who initially were into farming activities, but maybe because of climate change and others, their crops are failing. So they have to resort to probably either mining and looking for, gold, minerals, other minerals from other places, or when they were producing these food crops, because of how world markets detects, they don't get enough from their produce. So there has been instances like that where people have shifted from either farming to illegal mining because they don't get enough from their produce, and they see the illegal mining or the minerals as a quick way to get rich. So we need to think about all these things, because once your neighbor is living comfortably, right, then you can also live comfortable, right? So if you pick the Scandinavian countries as an example, crime rates is very low. And it's often because of that socialist, I know Americans hate socialism and communism, but I feel because of the welfare society, so everyone is living, ideally, everyone is well-to-do. So that they don't think about, let me rob this person or let me take this person. And I always use this example where, as a master student, I was coming back from Ghana. I'd bought a new phone. As at then, I think it was Sony Xperia V. It was one of the phones. And as I was running to catch the bus, the phone fell out of my pocket. And, based on my thinking, I was like, I'll never get this phone back. I got in, spoke to my neighbor, and who was also a friend. And I said, Wanya, I don't think I'm going to get this phone back. He said, no, let's call the phone. We called, someone picked it up. I said, oh, yeah, I found it on the floor. I've dropped it at 7-Eleven. Yeah, so when you go, just show an ID and they'll give it to you. We went and truly we got our phone back. I got the phone back. But if I should drop such a phone in New York, do you think I'll get it back? Why? It's because someone living in Oslo, because of the way society is structured, doesn't need your phone to survive, right? They're already well-to-do, So once I always say, once we reach the level where as society we are at equilibrium or equity, right? There is equity among everyone. Then I feel most of our problems we can address or will be addressed, right? I don't know whether that answers your question.
No, it certainly opens up the conversation for a lot of people, right? Like so many folks see, climate change is a possibility, but there's so much more beyond. Like
exactly.
That's why what I was so curious to know what an environment means to you, right? This is an environment. I leave my phone here. I leave my laptop here. It will be fine.
Yeah.
But why are environments designed this way? What's influencing environments? So
exactly.
It's worthwhile to. And what's so interesting is that's geography.
Yeah.
That's what's the coolest thing over here right now.
Yeah. And the whole issue is, especially some of these, we need to protect. Let's pick the Amazon, for instance. It plays a very vital role in, the global environmental, because of the oxygen that trees release to the atmosphere, the cooling effect and other things. And most of the times you find that vulnerable population lives around these locations, right? And either vulnerability in terms of either they are indigenous people who probably are not even engaged in any economic activities degrading the land, but due to certain economic activities, they are being kicked off or their life is being, or vulnerability in terms that because of socioeconomic challenges, people have to resort to, degrading the environment, which in a way exacerbate their situation even further in order to make amends meet, right? Or make ends meet, sorry, that's the right word, make ends meet. So we need to, but if you give these people alternative source of livelihood, right? And they know that, okay, instead of cutting down, degrading, uprooting this forest, I can make livelihood through these other alternative approaches. Then, they would even serve as guardian or custodians for these vital assets, right? So that's where we come in, and that's where geography is very important. We identify the key vulnerable areas, vulnerable population, what contributes to their vulnerability, what are the measures we need to put in place, because the measures will differ. For someone in maybe Amazon who is classified as vulnerable, what makes them vulnerable might be different from someone living in, let's say, the Congo Basin, or someone living in, where I come from, Ghana, in Western region, classified as being vulnerable.
I'd like to take it in this final direction before we conclude, right? There's this, you're from Ghana.
Yeah.
You've gone to the Scandinavia, after that Norway. Then you've gone to Canada. Yeah. And then you've gone back to Scandinavia. And now you're here at NYU, right? What are these decisions based on, like, it was a better academic way for, what made you choose these specific regions? You have the world, right? Based on the way you think.
Yeah. So my first travel to the Scandinavian or Norway was rather informed by necessity, but the others were conscious choice. Necessity because when I finished, I was thinking about doing my master's, and I come from a very financially challenged background in terms of my family. So I had actually started a master's program, and I was thinking I was going to the second year, and how to pay, my fees was a challenge. And so one of my professors back in Ghana introduced me to, or mentioned the idea of this quota scholarship, where the Norwegian government gives this scholarship to needy but brilliant students. So I applied for it and I got it. But I also learned a lot being in that environment because of the exposure, right? Of, how society operates, how the things goes on, and also in terms of what is of priority. So I realized that in Ghana, in terms of my research, the things that are of priority were not of priority in Europe because of what was happening over there. So it kind of shape your perspective in terms of what's of priority to different population. Now, when it came to my master's, because of the language barrier in Norway, I decided to seek an English-speaking country for my PhD rather, because I wasn't involved in the academic training, involved in research. And so even though there was an opportunity to continue doing my PhD in Norway, I opted to rather do it elsewhere because I thought I needed that training, and I'm someone who is always passionate about research. And so it was certain skill set I felt I lacked. So that's why. And the same reason why I went to Denmark, because it was a new research center that focused on using big data to understand the relationship between human environment interaction and health outcome. And I thought it was interesting, right? Because it's a novel field, and some of the things and the ideas that was being the aims of the project itself was exciting to me as a person or as a researcher. So that made me move to Denmark after my PhD. Yeah.
And now you're teaching over here.
Yeah.
How is the transition? And I believe you have to teach when you're in a PhD in some universities as well, right?
So, yeah.
How has that transition been from being student to teacher for you?
I think I'm someone who always love interacting with students. So when I finished my high school in Ghana, there is this 1 year period that you wait before getting into the university. And I actually taught in elementary school, and I love the interaction with students. I love sharing ideas, learning from students as well. I feel, especially when it comes to the academic environment, it's a bi-directional feedback. There's always things to learn from your students, often either because of where they are coming from or generational gap, and there's all things that you as an instructor impart on your student as well. So I've always loved that. So during my PhD, yes, I did teach or tutor courses. And even after my master's, I went back to Ghana to teach for a year before starting my PhD in Canada. And here I'm teaching as well. And one thing I love about the School of Global Health is the diversity in terms of the student population. I interact with students coming from different parts of the world, and it enriches the discussion you have in class, right? And because often if you are, say, from the United States, you might be these are the things that are happening within, but you are not aware of what is happening in, let's say, in Ghana, in let's say Sri Lanka, in India, China, other Zimbabwe and other places. And that's the richness or the diversity of the student body in NYU, and also in the School of Global Public Health helps that discussion. And I had one student who actually told me one of the classes I'm teaching this semester, or the class I'm teaching this semester, is the most global course she's ever taken during her study in NYU, because of the breadth of the perspective that comes. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Prince, you have opened our minds up to, first off, the podcast started off with geography. It's not a common subject to speak. So thank you for simplifying it, opening our minds to what the possibilities are. If you could leave us with something, right? Like how should we view the concept of environment and geography going forward? We have listeners that might be from your country as well right now. We might have listeners that are students at the school. We might have listeners that randomly clicked on this video or this podcast. How can we create a relationship with geography going forward?
Well, I think we can create a relationship with geography by embedding some of these geographical thinking into the things we do, not just in research, but even in our everyday activities, as well as policy, formulations and program. And it's very important, as I mentioned earlier, because geography, when you incorporate geographical thinking into whatever you are doing, then you are bridging the gap, right, between the haves and the have-nots, between the inequalities that exist within any given context, right? Because you become critical of, the differences that exist within your population. So even as a politician or as, let's say, a stakeholder, that, this is what I need to do in order to improve the life of my constituents, right? So it's geographical thinking. I feel it's a basic knowledge that all of us must embody into our way of life, into the things we do. And in terms of the environment, we have to think about it as an extension of our body, right? Because ideally, you will not want to cut off your arm because of the pain and the things, the health effects that you have. So if you think of the environment as something that makes you as a human live comfortable, sustains your life, then you know that, okay, whatever I do to the environment in the long run affects me. So I wouldn't want to, in the sense that I wouldn't want to cut off my arm, or I wouldn't want to, stab myself or something like that. Then I have to treat the environment with care. I need to respect the environment. I need to be, reflective of my actions. For example, if I'm buying a cup of coffee, after drinking, can I use this cup for something else? Or do I just throw it away, dump it everywhere,
What is my relationship with that?
Exactly.
Yeah. Sounds like it applies to friendships, relationships, breakups, makeups. It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah. And like I said, the environment is bigger, right? It's also referred to social relations. So how can I improve the life of, those around me, right? Because ultimately, these, it's often called social capital. You need that, it's an asset, and it can be a blessing or a curse, depending on how it's structured. And we need that as a person to function. As humans, we are social beings, right? Sitting here, chatting with you, in a way elevates my excitement level, makes me happy. So it kind of improves my mental health and my well-being, right? As opposed to if, for example, there is some form of antagonism between us, there's a strife, I'm always agitated by the sight of seeing you. So it's, dampens my spirits. It's not good for me mentally, right? So it's all part of it. We need to think broadly in terms of when we talk about geography and the environment. So all aspects is very important. The social is important. The financial is important. The physical, the buildings, the natural, animals, everything is important.
It's for the long term, and I certainly hope there's no strifes between us going forward. This has been a delight, Dr. Prince. Thank you for exposing us to this entire new world, to me at least, and a lot of listeners that will be. And thanks for taking the time out to hop on the podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be part of this show, and I'm happy to be here. The pleasure's mine always, Amma.
All right, folks. We'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for tuning in, and everything will be in the description regarding what you heard today. Take care.